All right, so because I want to try and get through the end of this book and give you just a little bit through the different chapters, chapter 17, where we pick up, is right after the monster gives his own frame story. So we now step back out. We're no longer three frame stories in, but just two. So back to where our narrator is no longer the monster, but instead Victor Frankenstein. Essentially, what comes up in this chapter is the fact that the monster has one request. He will leave Frankenstein alone. He will flee and never come back as long as he agrees to make him a female companion. What's interesting about this chapter is as the monster works on persuading Victor to go through with this, we see how his logic makes a lot of sense. So the fact that the only reason he acts the way that he does is because he's miserable because of how mankind treats him. On page 106 in the book, it says, I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? You, my creator, would tear me to pieces in triumph. Remember that, and tell me why I should pity man more than he pities me. So he has these really great arguments that he builds up using specifically logos. And Frankenstein, in the moments that he initially does try and push back, doesn't really seem to have an argument that can combat. So he eventually ends up relenting and he agrees to it. One of the things that I think is interesting about this short chapter is we've got some more allusions to Paradise Lost and the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible. So the monster finishes some story, and essentially what he's asking Victor for, his creator, is a new Eden. So in this case, God abandoned him. His God abandoned him, Victor, and he wasn't given every possible comfort and opportunity to do right. So it's almost an ironic comparison that we're given here because the monster just kind of wants what's due his. He wants an opportunity to live out his life, not messing with anybody else. But really, what we find is that he just desires love and companionship. He says, my vices are children of the forced solitude that I abhor, and my virtues will necessarily arise when I live in communion with an equal. I shall feel the affection of a sensitive being and become linked to the chain of existence and events from which I am now excluded. So essentially, all he wants to do is love. And this again can be tied back to the whole idea that in nature versus nurture, he has this innate quality where he just wants acceptance. And so we give Victor some credit in this chapter and we feel some sympathy for the monster because Victor sees that and he agrees at the end of this chapter to make him a female. Now, does he agree because he has sympathy for the monster and he sees his reason, or because he's selfish and wants to get rid of him? He makes him promise multiple times that he will leave, go to the farthest corners of South America and never come back. So at the end of chapter 17, we're left with that, kind of hokey, foreboding, foreshadowing that Victor's going to start working on another companion while the monster kind of lingers in the background. All right, moving on to chapter 18. Chapter 18 is on the longer side for this novel, but essentially there's really a couple main things I'd like you to take away from this. So the initial thing is at the beginning of chapter 18, after he has returned to Geneva and made this agreement to the monster, Frankenstein is still at home with his family, because remember, this is all in the wake of Justine's trial and the murder of his youngest brother. So his father, seeing how he's still upset, essentially brings up to him to the fact that he would like him to marry Elizabeth. Now, the dad kind of has this misconception that Frankenstein loves somebody else because that's why, he's only seen Elizabeth as a sister. But Victor reassures him that he has always looked forward to a union of marriage. What's interesting about this at the beginning of the chapter is Victor's father, desiring for him to be happy, really encourages him to have a mate, have someone to share his life with. The irony here, obviously, is that Victor, who is also kind of a father, he is being forced to have a union or to create a partner for the monster because he doesn't care about his happiness. So we see this kind of contrast there. Despite his father wishing him to, get married now, especially because his own health is kind of failing. Despite this, Victor knows that he really can't commit to this marriage until he gets to the task at hand. So on page 111 in your book, there's actually a couple interesting things that happen. One is we have another allusion to the rhyme of the ancient mariner. He refers to this task of creating this companion for the monster as the albatross that's hanging around his neck. So, another thing that kind of likens him to the ancient mariner from our poem. But we also see that here again, he's choosing science over love. Um, so you could argue, realism or almost, kind of this technology and industry over natural things like love, which is really interesting in this chapter because a lot of the longer descriptions have to do with how being in nature makes him feel as he's floating down the Rhine River in a boat, staring up at the sky as he considers, the stars, or just going on these solitary walks on his own. These things all refresh him. The last two pages of the chapter, actually, he comments because his father doesn't want him leaving by himself. He has this task to complete. He doesn't want to make this being under his father's roof, so he plans on returning to London. So Henry accompanies him, and the last two pages really kind of have to do with him thinking about Henry and how being in these different places and seeing these beautiful sights affects Henry. Now, it's a little bit superfluous. It's more information than you might feel you need to get to the main idea of this chapter. But nevertheless, there's some interesting things that start to happen. He keeps having these breaks in his narrative where he's directly talking to Robert Walton in the present. And there's also an allusion that happens on page 115, which is to Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Now, not knowing a ton about Tintern Abbey, it's a very long poem. Some of you have read part of it in the skill packet. Essentially, what this passage is doing, it's a poem. Tintern Abbey is a poem about returning to somewhere, finding comfort in the memory of a place you have got to visit. So we almost get a sense of foreboding or foreshadowing here because he's remembering this time with Henry, and he brings in this allusion. At the end of the chapter, he even says, "And where does he now exist? Is this gentle and lovely being lost forever?" Referring to Henry Clerval. So as they continue on their journey towards London, we get this feeling that, something bad is going to happen to Henry. His decision at the end of chapter 16, how does it affect him in chapter 18? Well, essentially, he's miserable, right? He's back to looking sickly, looking pale. One thing about chapter 18 also, the chapter demonstrates that Henry is a foil character to Victor. One appreciates and shines in regard to the appreciation of nature. He has a romantic sense of the beauty and power. The other finds his devotion purely to the task that he is going to complete, to scientific advancements. We see the two being at odds with one another. Let's see, anything else here? At the end of chapter 18, how does he build irony with his situation with the monster? By discussing nature as the wonders of God's creations. Again, as they both kind of sit here and revel in the beauty around them as they're on their way to London, we can't help but think of how Victor is inadvertently playing God on his own and messing with some of the natural beauty and failing to recognize that. All right. So from chapter 18, we fly right on along to chapter 19. All right, for the most part, chapter 19 is really kind of an homage for Mary Shelley to really kind of flex her muscles with the whole tenets of romanticism. So there's a lot of focus on the places that Henry and Victor visit. They make it to London, and as soon as they get there, it seems actually not as soon as they get there, but as soon as the chapter starts, we're already 5 months in. They've been in London 5 months, from the beginning of October to February, and they hear some correspondence from a friend in Scotland. Essentially, they're invited to come to Scotland, and because Clerval doesn't, really, he's not privy to why specifically that they're in London, he wants to go. So they decide to go, and Victor says, yeah, I can just kind of work on this, at some place up in the Highlands of Scotland. So over the next several pages and through much of the chapter, it's really a description of these two rambling around England. So they go to these different sites. They go to Matlock. They go to Derby. They see a lot of these different Gothic castles and spend some time just kind of appreciating nature. Eventually, at the end of the chapter, Victor leaves Henry. He tells him, go see this area on your own. And Victor travels himself up to the northernmost highlands. Really, the only thing I can say about the symbolism in this chapter is the scene that he describes, the place where he's going to finish his work on this monster's companion. It's a barren place. It's a bunch of rocks. It's solitary. It's isolated, which is kind of foreshadowing what's going to happen. And towards the end, in the last paragraph or two, we see the decline in health and wellness of Victor as he continues to live in fear of the monster. So, flying through that chapter now, we're going to get to chapter 20. All right, so for chapter 20, just a few notes before we kind of go through and summarize some of the finer points of it. Victor has a fear at the start of chapter 20. So this is when he's in this little hut in Scotland, and he's essentially been building this female companion. And as he looks on her, he starts to reflect. So in the first paragraph or so, he says, kind of jot over. As I sat, a train of reflection occurred to me, which led me to consider the effects of what I was now doing. 3 years before, I was engaged in the same manner, and had created a fiend whose unparalleled barbarity had desolated my heart and filled it forever with the bitterest remorse. I was now about to form another being, of whose dispositions I was alike ignorant. She might become 10,000 times more malignant than her mate, and delight, for its own sake, in murder and wretchedness. He had sworn to quit the neighborhood of man and hide himself in the deserts, but she had not, and she, who in all probability was to become a thinking and reasoning animal, might refuse to comply with the compact made before her creation. They might even hate each other. The creature who already lived loathes his deformity, and might he not conceive a greater abhorrence for it when he comes before the eyes of a female form? She also might turn with disgust from him into the superior beauty of man. She might quit him, and he be again alone, exasperated by the fresh provocation of being deserted by one of his own species. So the initial fear that he has is that, like he had no control over the monster, he won't have any over the female. Now, really, we could say this is ironic because he could have had control over the monster, only he fled from him, he left him. But the thing that really kind of turns him to do the crazy thing that he does next is not just this idea that he can't control the female, but he also kind of goes down that hole of the worst thing that could possibly happen is, but what if they do like each other and they decide to reproduce, they decide to have kids, and then he unleashes this whole, he calls them a race of devils on the earth. So a couple things to point out just in his thought process here. One thing, and this could be maybe one of our feminist lens notes, is his focus on the uncertainty of the woman is what makes him reconsider his promise. So he doubts the intentions of this woman. This could also be seen, going back to our Garden of Eden, as far as, the woman is the one that messed everything up. She's the one that kind of tempted Adam or manipulated him. And so that's his fear here as well, that they're going to go to this new place and start this whole new race of men, which inadvertently also gives him kind of a God complex. He would be the one to unleash this entire race. So based on this fear, he decides to rip up the monster, tear her limb from limb before he reanimates her. And he finds that the monster has in fact followed him all the way from London, and actually confronts him in this little hut that he's in the middle of nowhere. The monster says on page 123, "You have destroyed the work which you began. What is it that you intend? Do you dare break your promise?" And essentially he says, yeah. So with as fearful as he always is, it's funny how he gets these little moments of bravado when he's in front of the monster, basically saying, yeah, I did this, and you got to deal with it now. The monster here, many people consider this a turning point because once he decides to, Frankenstein decides to rip this monster, the female monster up, we get the hokey threat of the creature, which will eventually lead us back to Robert Walton and the outermost layer of our frame story. So when he sees that the woman is not going to be made, he says, Man you may hate, but beware, your hours will pass in dread and misery, and soon the bolt will fall upon which must ravish you from your happiness forever. Are you to be happy while I grovel at the intensity of my wretchedness? You can blast my other passions, but revenge remains. Revenge henceforth, dearer than light or food. I may die, but first you, my tyrant and tormentor, shall curse the sun that gazes on your misery. And then his most hokey of all threats is he says, "It is well that I go, but remember I shall be with you on your wedding night." So remember, with as strong as the creature is, he no doubt could kill Victor right here. But he's going to enact this sense of kind of mob justice. He's going to start focusing on picking off the people that he loves one by one. So with the monster's departure, uh, Frankenstein is left alone, and go figure, he starts to feel sad and alone. Eventually, he comes back to the workshop where he is, and there's this very gruesome scene. There's these body parts everywhere, part of the Gothic feature here. Um, but he decides, after getting a letter from Henry Clerval, that he needs to move on. He needs to go see Henry. But first, the task at hand is he has to get rid of all of these evidence. So he cleans all of his apparatus and his tools off in the ocean, which symbolically could be seen as nature cleansing him of all of this trouble that science and technology brought on. And then he gathers all of the parts of the female monster's body, puts them in a bucket, and takes his little sailboat out into the water. Um, Once he drops them into the ocean, to be carried away, we've got this image of him being stranded on the ocean in a little boat. Now, this is also something that could be kind of a metaphor for the situation he's gotten himself in, being stranded alone out in the middle of this giant thing that he has no control over. And for some reason, I don't really understand this, he falls asleep. I guess maybe the burden is gone, because the monster is gone and he has abandoned his task. But Frankenstein falls asleep in this little boat, and essentially he wakes up in quite a pickle. He has his sail has been destroyed. He has no way to steer the rudder. He can't see any land. And eventually, after having fear, and you going through his whole dramatic Frankenstein anxiety thing, he sees some land. And when he eventually is able to find his way over to the land, he has to take off some of his clothes to fix them into a makeshift sail. He's probably dirty, having been all night. He's thirsty, he's hungry, so he looks pretty much in a state. And when he rolls up on land, there's a group of people waiting for him. Now, he expects them to kind of be more friendly than they are. He looks pretty pathetic. Maybe they should ask him if they can help him. But instead, they look almost as if they've turned on him. And the reason we find out is that they think he's a criminal, and they are taking him directly to see the magistrate, which is the judge, Mr. Kerwin, because there was a man murdered here last night, here being Ireland. So he's drifted. In the final paragraph of this chapter, Victor alludes to having to pause because he's very upset by the things that he has to now sit and recount. All right, chapter 21 is, again, it's a little bit on the longer side, but this is essentially the fallout from what the body was discovered, and Victor being accused upon arriving in his little boat on the shore of Ireland. So essentially, what happens at the beginning of chapter 21 is he's brought before the magistrate, which is the judge. And he's told of the accounts of the night. They're telling him about how people saw his little boat and the body that they found on land. And as they're going through this, Victor doesn't really care. He doesn't really have a lot of sympathy for this life that was taken until, because he's not having any kind of reaction, the judge says that they should probably show him the body to see if he has any kind of reaction. So when they bring him to the body, this is on the bottom of page 130 in the book. Essentially, he realizes that it's Henry Clerval that has been killed. And he's killed in the same manner that William was killed, which is strangulation, so they can see the marks of the fingers around his neck. And as our motif has been suggesting up to this point, when Victor realizes that it's Henry, he faints and he falls into a fever. So he falls into an illness. And it actually says that he's ill for 2 months. Now, one of the things that we can do with this chapter, because it's again about somebody on trial for murder, is we can compare it back to chapter 8 with Justine's trial. Now, in Justine's trial, she was not giving any sort of benefit of the doubt. She was kept in kind of a dungeon with, hay, and she was really forced in the interrogation, to kind of bullied into confession. So coming back to the idea of social criticism, here we see it's a lot different. When Victor gets through all of his self-pity and wakes up, he finds that he's in a jail cell, mind you, the nicest jail cell. He has his own personal nurse that's been watching over him. And when he meets with the judge basically says, hey, don't worry, there should be enough evidence to get you out of here. They've actually even sent for his relatives. They've sent for his father to come and be with him. So, a couple of the things we'll take away from this chapter. One of them is the irony in the fact that Victor's father is the one who's there when he is saved. So, his father, his creator, coming to his rescue, they are all able to, he's able to support him and kind of reassure him that everyone back home is safe. He's there when they realize that Victor was indeed on the Orkney Islands instead of being in Ireland and able to murder Clerval. So, he not only is with him through this harsh time, but he also takes care of him, and he is going to bring him back home. So again, the irony here is the fact that Victor's father is the one that saves him, and he has not been able to save his creation. There's also the criticism of the difference between how Victor was treated, being a man, and Justine was treated, where there was no mercy shown to her. So we could say, because, it's not enough just to say, here's irony, there's irony, isn't this ironic? But the function of irony in this text so far seems to be a social commentary or a criticism, right? Criticizing the creators that don't watch out for their creations, criticizing the treatment of women overall. So there's a lot of this that we see coming through in chapter 21. So by the end of chapter 21, they are on their way home. Again, not going straight there, which you'd think might be, a good idea, since it seems the monster's picking off his loved ones. But they're going to kind of mull about because Dad is worried that maybe he's not feeling so well because we have this sickness. So it brings us to almost the end. We're on chapter 22. All right, in this chapter, eventually Victor is starting to, if not regain his health, at least start to reflect on the actions of what's happened a little bit better. His father takes care of him as they continue their kind of meandering journey back home to Geneva, Switzerland. They stop in Paris for a while. For a while, he decides to just be selfish and not tell anybody what's truly plaguing him. They return to what he kept yelling over and over again when he was fevered ill for those 2 months, which is that he was the murderer of William, Justine, and now Henry. And so one of the things that kind of bugs me in this chapter is that Victor is so self-important and so self-pitying. He does not seem to take responsibility for his actions. After the first few paragraphs in this chapter, eventually, though, we have another letter, this time from Elizabeth. And the letter from Elizabeth is, again, the woman as kind of this martyr, this sacrificial person. She basically assumes that Victor is kind of dilly-dallying and he's unhappy because he's in love with somebody else. He doesn't want to get married to her. So she kind of offers to release him because she doesn't want anything to happen that would make him unhappy. But she reassures him that the only thing she needs to be happy is, in fact, him. Immediately upon hearing Elizabeth talk about their wedding, he's reminded of the threat from the monster that he will be with him on his wedding night. And he kind of comes to the idea that at this point, death is freedom. Either he is free from the monster if he dies, or if he is able to kill the monster, they will all be free. So he comes back home to Geneva. Elizabeth is excited to see him. He doesn't look very good. He's gone. But again, some more of this maybe social criticism as he comments on how she also doesn't look that great. So now she's a more fitting partner for him since he's all gaunt and ill. But she also is able to restore him. She's able to get him out of these fits that he has. Um, and he decides that despite the threat from the monster, he is going to get married to Elizabeth, even if it's hastening his own death. On the second to last page of this chapter, on page 141, we have some more of this foreshadowing. He's so wrapped up in himself and his own self importance that he really, for a smart guy, doesn't really think through the monster's threat. At this point, he could have killed him many times over, meaning him, Victor, but instead, he's going after all the people he loves. So when he's been saying, I'll be with you on your wedding night, Victor keeps taking it as a threat to himself, not realizing, as he kind of says in his narration on page 141. When I thought I had prepared only my own death, I hastened that of a far dearer victim. So we kind of have a sense that this marriage, because it's planned in the shadow of death and because of Victor's ill appearance, it's already kind of doomed. The last two pages of chapter 22 have to deal with their union. So something that should be a joyous occasion is kind of not. Victor carries a knife and a pistol around with him everywhere. And after they're married, they take a boat to a villa that they have on a lake. And at the end of chapter 22, with all this water imagery, Victor's bad feelings come up as they arrive at their destination. And that's the end of chapter 22. All right, in the last chapter of our story, our second frame story, before we get back to Robert Walton, things hasten. You could almost say that Victor destroying the female monster's body is kind of the climax of the book. There's a point of no return there. So everything after, with Clerval's death, with the wedding and what's about to happen, this is all part of just the falling action, things coming to play before we get to the ending chapter, which is our resolution. So in chapter 23, on the wedding night, Victor is hyper vigilant. He's carrying a pistol. He's looking out for the monster. And in his own kind of cloud of self importance, he sends Elizabeth away, tells her to go take care of herself, and he'll be down soon. So he's only watching out for himself, and he isolates Elizabeth. So it's no shock to any of us when he hears a scream and he runs downstairs into the bedroom to find that Elizabeth has been killed, strangled. As he kind of sits there and grieves over her, and he takes out a pistol because he sees the monster grinning at him through the window. They comb the area, and this all happens in pretty rapid succession. There's not a lot of detail given. Essentially, he's upset. He knows that he now kind of clicks that the monster is picking off all those close to him. So he resolves to get back to Geneva as quickly as possible to be with his brother and his father. Upon arriving back, he delivers the grim news that Elizabeth is dead, and lo and behold, his father finds no other purpose to live and succumbs to death in a few days' time. From there, in our last really 2 pages of this chapter, Victor begins on page 147, one paragraph with a rhetorical question. What then became of me? I know not. So in other words, everything that happened from the point of his father dying up until basically now kind of is a blur for him. He was locked up for a while because of the things he was yelling. They thought he was crazy. Eventually he's allowed out, and he finds a magistrate, a judge that will listen to him. And he basically, finally, after all this time, when he could have gone to the authorities much, much earlier, says, the story is too connected to be mistaken for a dream, and I have no motive for falsehood. So he's going to tell them the truth about this monster that he's created and these terrible things that have been happening. So he tells the judge, who at first doesn't believe him and then is almost on the precipice of believing him. But when Victor asks them to help him go after him, the judge basically says it sounds useless. The way that you've created him, the way that he can move and avert, no one would be able to catch him. So on the bottom of page 148, Victor resolves, since no one will help him, he says, my revenge, the devouring and only passion of my soul. I have but one resource, and I devote myself either in my life or my death to his destruction. So something interesting here is how much he hates the monster, how much he sounds like him right now, right? They both have one purpose left to live for, and that's to destroy the other. It's at this point that the magistrate essentially says, okay, well, You are probably just delirious because you had a fever after you found out your wife was dead. Um, and the irony in his final statement to the magistrate on page 149 is, Man, how ignorant art thou in thy pride of wisdom! Cease, you know not what it is you say. So, calling somebody else too proud in order to see the effects. And that brings us to the end of the story that is being recounted. So, chapter 24 is going to take us now back to Robert Walton and Victor in the Arctic Circle. The first few pages of chapter 4 actually kind of wind up Victor and his exit from Geneva. So he very quickly kind of goes through and tells how he quit there, how his attitude changed. And we can say that there is a considerable change in characterization from the sickly, ill person that was afraid to act for, all of those years earlier in the book and the frame story, till now when he becomes really resolute to find and enact his vengeance. So we could almost say that in creating his creature, he has created a monster of himself because he's losing all traces of humanity. He has this one singular focus, and that's only to enact destruction on this creature. An interesting thing that we see is as he talks about his pursuit of the monster, because now he's the one chasing the monster. He remarks on how even though the monster could easily elude him, if it ever seems like he's going to lose him or not be able to track him, the monster leaves some kind of a clue behind so that Victor's able to continue to follow him. So what the monster has always longed for, which is Victor's attention, and Victor to be a guide for him in life. Ironically, Victor is now finally fulfilling that duty for him, even with vengeance in his heart instead of love and acceptance. So the monster, in some ways, you could almost see him as enjoying this, wanting him to be found. It's like when you play hide and go seek with a little kid and they kind of give away their hiding spot. So after the first few pages, we then get to the continuation of Robert Walton. So the frame story officially ends, and the last thing that Frankenstein asks Walton for in his narration is if he happens to die before the monster comes around. He doesn't want to burden him with having to seek out the monster, but if the monster is to show up, he says, kill him for me. All right, as Robert Walton takes over the narration here at the end, there's a couple parts that can be a little bit confusing. Essentially, he talks about how he doesn't have much time left, maybe a week, and he needs to kill the monster. In the beginning, as soon as his tale is finished, before this week is up, we get a little more of this connection to Rime of the Ancient Mariner. When Robert Walton admits, sometimes I endeavored to gain from Frankenstein the particulars of his creature's formation, but on this point he was impenetrable. So he's still curious, despite the cautionary tale he's just been told. So Frankenstein admonishes him, Are you mad, my friend? Or whither does your senseless curiosity lead you? Would you also create for yourself in the world a demoniacal enemy? Peace, peace, learn my mistakes, and do not seek to increase your own. So here he again takes on that role of the ancient mariner, cautioning the wedding guest. Going back over how he says, I believed myself destined for some great enterprise, and look what has happened to me. So through this and the letters that follow, Robert Walton, has learned something. He says, It is terrible to reflect that the lives of all of these men are endangered through me. If we are lost, my mad schemes are the cause. So he seems to have learned from this story that he shouldn't put the lives of others and the happiness of others above his own ambitions and his own desires for greatness. The confusing part comes from the speech that Frankenstein delivers once he agrees that if the ice breaks up, he'll head south instead of trying to continue north. Frankenstein kind of admonishes him and makes him seem like it's better to be victorious, right? He says, I would rather die than return shamefully my purpose unfulfilled, which is ironic because what we know is coming next. Despite this wavering from Frankenstein, though, whether it's his fever speaking or whatnot, Robert Walton does learn, and he says, The die is cast. I have consented to return if we are not destroyed. So he's going to make the decision that Frankenstein couldn't, and he's going to do the humane thing and lead the men back home. At the end of the book, Frankenstein dies. He passes away. His body gives out, and the monster returns to see him. Robert Walton actually sees the monster because he approaches him, and he's got a really nice kind of narrative at the end where he talks about the injustice that was done to him in life. And kind of how he feels about the sinful acts he committed. He was ready to stop after he killed Henry because he pitied Frankenstein and the damage that he'd done. But when Frankenstein thought that he deserved some kind of happiness, he decides to enact revenge and finish him off. Um, Essentially, the monster is able in the end to come to terms with the sins that he has done, the terrible things that he has done, and he vows to remove himself from the equation. He's going to float out on an ice raft, build a funeral pyre, and burn himself up. So, with that, with him leaving Robert Walton, that's the end of the book. So, what do we kind of see here? Well, one of the things that we note at the end of the book um, is really about the idea of blame and who's to blame here. We could say that Victor Frankenstein says that he created a monster, but who is the monster he created? Is it the creature, or is it the singularly focused individual that he turned into? Here are some questions that could help, focus your ending for chapter 24. But I think the bigger question here is, we could return to this idea of the tragic hero. Um, who is the more noble of the two, of Frankenstein or his creature, right? Um, so there's a lot here about the idea, bringing us back to our the Ancient Mariner and character growth and who's learning things and kind of what the overall caution is. Um, but it's safe to say that, Robert Walton is left with the same feeling that the wedding guest learned. Love and respect all of God's creatures, don't overstep your bounds. And it may have made him a more wise, experienced man, a sadder man, but ultimately he learned this lesson for himself.